The Galactic League watched entire planets die, calm, methodical, precise. Millions of lives were written off as evolutionary error, and interference was a crime against the universe itself. Alarms sounded. Death was expected. Hope had no place here. Then the impossible happened. Humans did not ask permission. They tore through quarantines, landing on worlds the galaxy had declared lost. Domes flared open, machines roared to life, and the deadliest virus became irrelevant, not defeated, just ignored. The League had never accounted for refusal. And in that refusal, everything changed. The Galactic League had been founded on arithmetic, not mercy, and its power was measured in silent orbits rather than banners or armies. Its councils drifted above sterile stars whose light never warmed a living world, vast rings of alloy and crystal where atmosphere was filtered to remove even the suggestion of scent. Within those chambers, decisions fell like guillotines, clean and final, guided by equations older than most civilizations still capable of remembering their own beginnings. When the pandemic ignited across the low-gravity worlds of the Rhel Expanse, it did not announce itself with drama. It crept through ventilation systems and communal water cycles, multiplied in thin bloodstreams adapted to weaker gravity, and bloomed invisibly inside lungs never meant to fight it. Sensors detected the anomaly before the first cities understood they were dying. Data streams lit up council chambers in cold blues and sterile whites, projecting infection curves that rose like tidal waves and resource graphs that collapsed into empty voids. The calculations were completed within minutes. Consumption rates outpaced production. Medical capacity failed under projected load. Population collapse was not a possibility but a certainty, its probability approaching mathematical purity. The numbers did not scream. They whispered inevitability. Several million lives were reduced to variables, their extinction plotted across neat timelines that ended in silence. The verdict required no debate. It was unanimous and bloodless, delivered without ceremony. Non-interference was declared as a matter of doctrine, not cruelty. Quarantine zones were sealed with humming containment fields that wrapped entire planets in shimmering veils. Patrol fleets took their positions, engines idling in disciplined formation, their hulls reflecting the sickly glow of infected atmospheres below. Warning sirens echoed across empty skies, their sound thin and pointless, reverberating through cities already too weak to respond. From distant observation platforms, League analysts watched as lights failed continent by continent. Urban centers dimmed into constellations of dying power grids. Agricultural domes fogged with condensation and rot. The air itself grew heavy with the metallic tang of decay, a chemical signature logged and archived. No rescue ships descended. No relief convoys broke quarantine. Intervention would have disrupted natural selection, diluted future resilience, and expended galactic resources on populations deemed evolutionarily unviable. In the quiet halls of the League, the crisis was already being filed away. It was labeled a correction, a necessary pruning of the galactic tree. The logic was flawless. Mercy was inefficient. Survival, according to the League, belonged to those who could endure without assistance. As the last transmissions from the Rhel Expanse dissolved into static, the councils turned their attention elsewhere, confident that the universe had balanced itself once more. They did not yet understand that something else had been watching those same numbers and had reached a very different conclusion. From the observation platforms suspended above the quarantined worlds, alien epidemiologists watched entire civilizations fade in disciplined silence. The platforms rotated slowly, their motion dampened to near stillness, allowing uninterrupted study of the planets below. What they saw was not chaos, but order unraveling according to prediction. Cities dimmed one by one as power grids failed, their light dissolving into darkness like embers pressed beneath ash. Atmospheres thickened with chemical signatures of decay as biospheres choked under the weight of their own unchecked biology. The data streams were pristine. Infection vectors followed their projected arcs through population centers designed for efficiency rather than resilience. Low-gravity physiology, once celebrated for its elegance, betrayed its creators as weakened immune responses collapsed under viral pressure. Agricultural habitats turned toxic as microbial balance slipped beyond recovery thresholds. The smell of rot and sterilized air mingled in spectral readouts, translated into colors and waveforms that filled the analyst's vision. There was no need for alarm. Everything was proceeding as expected. The logic was flawless. Intervention, according to League doctrine, would do more harm than good. To save these populations would weaken future generations, embedding dependence where adaptation should have occurred. Natural selection, when interrupted, produced fragility. Resources spent on those who had already failed the test of survival would be resources stolen from worlds still capable of enduring. These principles were not debated. They were axioms, encoded into the League long before most member species had learned to measure time beyond their own lifespans. Patrol fleets enforced isolation with cold precision. Their vessels formed perfect geometries around infected systems, hulls matte and unadorned, designed to inspire neither hope nor fear. Containment shields hummed with a constant, subsonic vibration that bled through vacuum and into the thin atmospheres below. That sound became the last thing many populations heard, a distant mechanical presence that never approached and never left. Warning sirens echoed across empty plazas and abandoned transit corridors, their automated signals bouncing uselessly off structures already sealed by quarantine fields. Below the shields, evacuation attempts faltered and died. Civilian craft slammed against invisible barriers, their hulls scraping sparks of light from containment energy before tumbling back into polluted skies. Communications arrays burned out under constant distress signaling, leaving only static and fragmented pulses that dissolved before reaching open space. The observation platforms recorded it all with immaculate detachment, annotating failure points and behavioral patterns for future reference. Within the quiet halls of the League, the crisis had already been archived. The chambers where these decisions were made were vast and soundless, their floors polished to mirror smoothness, reflecting the pale glow of stellar maps suspended in the air. Atmospheres were tuned to optimal cognitive performance, stripped of any scent that might distract from calculation. Analysts moved without haste, their movements economical, their expressions unchanged. The pandemic of the Rhel Expanse was labeled resolved, its file sealed with a designation that translated loosely as natural conclusion. Records detailed the timeline of collapse with reverent precision. Initial outbreak, accelerated transmission, systemic failure, population termination. Each phase aligned neatly with historical precedents across dozens of species. There was comfort in that alignment, a reassurance that the universe remained predictable. Extinction, when properly understood, was not cruelty but correction, the removal of unstable variables from a complex equation. Some observers lingered longer than required at their stations, watching the final stages unfold. They saw the last emergency lights flicker out in subterranean habitats. They tracked the fading heat signatures of once crowded shelters as life support systems sputtered and failed. They noted the silence that followed, a measurable absence where biological activity had once thrummed. None of this registered as loss. It was data, clean and instructive. Patrol commanders filed routine reports confirming perimeter integrity. No unauthorized vessels had breached quarantine. No transmissions had escaped containment. The isolation was absolute, as doctrine demanded. The fleets maintained their positions with ritual exactness, engines cycling through maintenance patterns, crews rotating through shifts designed to minimize emotional drift. The quarantined worlds became distant objects, their suffering reduced to faint glows beneath containment fields. In academic annexes far from the crisis, lectures were updated. The Rhel Expanse would be cited as another example of evolutionary insufficiency, a cautionary case study for developing civilizations. Diagrams were prepared showing how minor physiological advantages could become fatal weaknesses under environmental stress. The lesson was clear and repeatable. Survival favored those who endured without aid. The League took pride in this clarity. Its authority rested on the belief that the universe was indifferent and that wisdom lay in aligning policy with that indifference. Compassion was considered a local adaptation, useful in limited social contexts but dangerous when scaled to interstellar governance. To feel was to risk error. To intervene was to interfere with outcomes already optimized by cosmic pressure. As the last biosignatures vanished from the Rhel Expanse, the observation platforms adjusted their sensors and prepared to disengage. The planets below were now quiet, their atmospheres settling into chemical equilibrium unburdened by respiration. From orbit, they appeared peaceful, unmarred by conflict or catastrophe. The shields remained for a prescribed interval, ensuring no residual contamination escaped, after which they would be dismantled and repurposed. The crisis, according to every metric the League trusted, was complete. What none of the archived reports captured was the subtle distortion that rippled through the quarantine net during those final hours. It registered as background noise, dismissed as sensor drift caused by stellar radiation. No alarms sounded. No analysts paused. The fleets held formation, confident in the perfection of their isolation. Beyond the perimeter, far from the sterile halls and immaculate equations, something had observed the same data and reached a conclusion that did not fit the model. And while the League turned its gaze away, certain trajectories were already bending, unseen, toward the sealed worlds. Humanity did not vote. Humanity did not ask. While the Galactic League finalized reports and archived extinction as a solved equation, motion stirred at the edge of the quarantine net like a disturbance in still water. Unregistered vessels altered course without filing intent, their transponders dark, their signatures masked beneath layers of obsolete civilian noise. They did not resemble warships. Their hulls were scarred and asymmetrical, reinforced for atmospheric shear rather than combat. Their surfaces burned and pitted by countless descents into hostile skies. They moved through blind spots that the League had never considered worth guarding. The quarantine net had been designed to stop fleets, not stubbornness. Its geometry assumed compliance, assumed fear, assumed that no rational species would willingly cross a boundary marked by certain death. Human ships exploited that assumption with quiet precision, threading between sensor arcs measured in fractions of planetary curvature, slipping through moments of stellar interference calculated not by probability models, but by experience etched into bone and memory. Inside those vessels, cargo bays were packed not with weapons, but with structures folded into impossible densities. Modular hospitals slept inside pressure frames, their surfaces coated in sterile white polymers that smelled faintly of antiseptic even through sealed bulkheads. Fabrication arrays lay dormant, ready to consume raw matter and exhale tools, shelters, and machinery at a moment's notice. Medical supplies filled every remaining cavity, their labels translated into dozens of biological standards. The crews moved through narrow corridors with ritual efficiency, hands steady, breaths measured, eyes fixed not on projections of success, but on the next task in an endless sequence of necessary actions. They measured time differently. Not in projected curves or statistical half-lives, but in heartbeats counted through gloves pressed against alien chests, in oxygen saturation levels flickering on cracked displays, in the slowing rhythm of a pulse brought back from the edge. To the watching sensors of the League, their approach resembled madness. Vessels accelerated directly into contaminated atmospheres, heat blooming along their hulls as they punched through skies thick with viral particulate and chemical decay. Shockwaves rippled across dying cities as landing craft tore open clouds and descended without clearance, without permission, without hesitation. The first landings shattered quarantine protocols in seconds. Containment fields flared and failed where human vessels forced their way through, dumping excess energy into the ground in thunderous discharges that rattled collapsing structures. Ramps dropped into streets slick with condensation and ash. Airlocks cycled against toxic pressure differentials, hissing and groaning as seals fought to hold. Human teams poured out into the chaos, their suits gleaming under emergency lights, boots splashing through runoff that carried more pathogens than water. Sealed domes began to bloom over dying cities like defiant flowers of light. They unfolded from compressed frames, petals of alloy and composite snapping into place with percussive cracks. Atmospheric processors roared to life, filtering air thick with rot and fear, scrubbing it until breathable layers settled over neighborhoods that had not drawn a full breath in days. Inside those domes, the sound changed. Sirens faded. Wind died. For the first time since the outbreak began, silence fell that was not the prelude to death. Human fabrication arrays ignited across the surface, their cores glowing as they consumed debris and raw soil, extruding corridors, wards, and treatment bays in continuous motion. Walls rose where buildings had collapsed. Power grids reknit themselves under human hands, cables snaking through ruins, sparks flying as connections were forced into place. The smell of ozone mixed with antiseptic and smoke, a harsh, living scent that clung to every surface. Light returned in harsh white bands, illuminating figures that had forgotten what illumination felt like. The League's sensors struggled to interpret what followed. Infection curves began to distort, their smooth ascents fracturing into erratic patterns. Human teams did not isolate the sick according to established doctrine. They reorganized entire populations within hours, reshaping social flow, altering movement patterns, changing how bodies encountered one another. Streets became one-way arteries. Habitats were subdivided and resealed. Air circulation was rerouted through improvised filters built from whatever materials were at hand. The disease was not confronted directly at first. It was starved, confused, deprived of the assumptions it relied upon to propagate. Medical intervention followed with relentless intensity. Humans worked without pause, cycling through exhaustion with mechanical discipline. When one collapsed, another stepped over them. When supplies ran low, fabrication arrays compensated. When protocols failed, they were rewritten on the fly, scribbled onto suit displays, and shared across networks that updated faster than the League's archives ever could. Treatments were combined, adjusted, discarded, resurrected. Dosages shifted in response to real-time feedback. The disease adapted, and humanity adapted faster. To alien observation platforms, the scene below defied categorization. There was no central command structure visible, no hierarchical broadcast directing the chaos. Instead, the humans moved like a distributed organism, each unit acting independently yet in concert, guided by shared intent rather than rigid instruction. Losses occurred. Sensors recorded human life signs vanishing amid the work. No retreat followed. No pause. The flow of effort did not diminish. Containment breaches multiplied as more vessels arrived, each slipping through quarantine geometry never meant to account for determination as a variable. The patrol fleets detected the incursions, but hesitated. Doctrine offered no response to rescue craft that carried no weapons and transmitted no threats. To fire would have required redefining enforcement parameters. To intervene would have acknowledged uncertainty. So the fleets watched, their shields humming softly, as human presence spread across worlds already declared dead. Within the domes, something unprecedented took shape. Infection rates slowed, then stalled. Entire districts stabilized. Bodies that should have failed according to League models continued to function under human care, supported by machines assembled hours earlier from scrap and raw ore. Children who had been marked as non-viable stirred beneath warming blankets. Elders drew breath through human-built respirators that whined and clicked with improvised precision. The League's long-range instruments flagged the anomaly as noise. The archives did not reopen. The reports remained sealed. Extinction, according to every approved equation, was still inevitable. On the ground, humanity ignored inevitability and kept working. Inside the quarantine zones, human effort crossed every boundary the League had defined as rational. Work did not slow when muscles trembled or vision blurred. It accelerated. Bodies pushed beyond exhaustion until exhaustion lost meaning, until pain became another background signal like the constant wail of sirens or the thunderous groan of domes under stress. Fear registered only as a chemical spike, acknowledged and discarded as hands continued to move, to lift, to cut, to seal, to build. Medicine was only the beginning. Humans did not treat the disease as an isolated enemy, but as a system embedded in environments, behaviors, and assumptions. Protocols shattered within hours of first contact. Treatments were spliced together in real time, layered and adjusted as feedback flooded in from thousands of monitoring points. Environmental controls were rewritten at the level of atmosphere itself, altering humidity, pressure gradients, and airflow to deny the pathogen stability. Light cycles shifted. Temperature bands narrowed and widened in deliberate patterns designed to exhaust viral reproduction. Cities were reshaped from the inside out. Streets once designed for convenience were repurposed into barriers and channels. Movement patterns changed as humans restructured daily life without pause or consultation. Entire neighborhoods rotated schedules, creating temporal separations that prevented mass exposure. Social proximity was no longer cultural but tactical, redefined hour by hour as data arrived. The disease hunted familiar pathways and found them gone, replaced by a maze that changed faster than it could adapt. Sirens wailed without pause, their tones rising and falling as alerts cascaded through human-built networks. The sound became a constant pressure in the air, vibrating through bones and teeth, a reminder that failure remained close. Above, the domes cracked and reformed under stress, their surfaces spiderwebbing with fractures that sealed themselves moments later in bursts of blinding light. Structural alarms screamed as pressure differentials surged, then fell, then surged again. Each time, humans reinforced, rerouted, compensated. Inside treatment zones, the air carried the sharp bite of antiseptic layered over the copper tang of blood and the sour undertone of sickness. Machines hummed, clattered, and whined, assembled from parts never meant to work together yet functioning through sheer insistence. Gloved hands moved from one patient to the next without hesitation, guided by continuously updating overlays that rewrote themselves as new patterns emerged. When a method failed, it was abandoned instantly. When something worked even briefly, it was expanded, replicated, and improved. The League's distant sensors watched the infection curves begin to distort. What had been smooth, inevitable ascents twisted into erratic shapes. Spikes flattened. Plateaus formed where collapse had been predicted. The models attempted correction after correction, feeding on their own assumptions, but the reality below refused alignment. Humans were not merely treating symptoms. They were dismantling the framework that allowed extinction to be efficient. Sleep became a rumor. Humans rotated through micro-rests measured in minutes stolen between crises. Nutrient packs were consumed without pause, tasted only as texture and temperature. Dehydration warnings flashed and were ignored until hands shook enough to require intervention. Even then, the response was mechanical, fluids injected, calories delivered, motion resumed. No one stopped long enough to consider heroism. There was only the next task, and the next life that might slip away if hands slowed. The pathogen responded as biology always did. It mutated. It shifted vectors. It altered surface structures in desperate attempts to regain traction. Each adaptation was met not with panic, but with interest. Humans tracked the changes, predicted the next move, and altered conditions again. They did not seek to eradicate the organism outright. They deprived it of relevance. Transmission routes collapsed. Replication windows narrowed to uselessness. Hosts recovered faster than the disease could exploit them. Within sealed domes, the soundscape changed. The constant coughing that had filled the air faded into isolated echoes. Emergency alerts quieted. Monitors that had screamed warnings began to pulse steady rhythms. Breathing normalized. Muscles regained strength. People who had been cataloged as lost sat up, confused, blinking against harsh white light that now meant survival rather than interrogation. 72 hours after the first unregistered vessels pierced quarantine, the impossible became undeniable. The pathogen did not vanish. It simply stopped maturing. It existed, but it could no longer spread effectively. It could no longer overwhelm. It had been rendered obsolete by a refusal to accept its rules. Humanity had not beaten the disease in battle. Humanity had made the battlefield irrelevant. Across multiple worlds, stabilization reports accumulated faster than the League's systems could flag them. Population collapse halted. Mortality rates plummeted to statistical insignificance. Entire regions transitioned from emergency to recovery in spans of time previously reserved for theoretical anomalies. The air itself seemed lighter, stripped of the invisible menace that had pressed against lungs and minds alike. Human teams did not celebrate. They shifted posture and began rebuilding with the same relentless focus they had applied to survival. Damaged infrastructure was repaired. Water systems were flushed and purified. Agricultural cycles restarted under revised parameters designed to resist future outbreaks. Education hubs activated, disseminating new behavioral frameworks that encoded resilience into daily life. The work expanded outward, from saving lives to ensuring those lives would not need saving again. Above it all, the quarantine shields remained, humming softly, enforcing a doctrine that no longer fit the reality beneath them. Patrol fleets continued to hold position, their crews watching telemetry that contradicted everything they had been taught to trust. The League's archives remained sealed, but alerts began to stack at their edges, unresolved anomalies demanding attention. Inside the domes, humans finally allowed themselves to slow. Some collapsed where they stood, bodies giving way now that urgency loosened its grip. Others remained upright, checking systems, verifying data, ensuring that stabilization was not an illusion. The air smelled cleaner. The sirens fell silent. The oppressive weight that had filled every moment receded, leaving behind a fragile, luminous calm. The pandemic had not been cured in the way the League understood curing. It had been outpaced, outmaneuvered, and rendered strategically irrelevant. Extinction had been scheduled, calculated, and approved. Humanity had torn up the schedule and refused the calculation. For the first time since the quarantine began, the worlds of the Rhel Expanse were no longer dying. They were breathing. Anomaly flags erupted across the League's observation lattice like fractures spreading through crystal. Streams of certainty collapsed into noise as extinction probabilities plunged toward zero, not gradually, but abruptly, as if a fundamental constant had been removed from the equation. Entire populations stabilized in regions already archived as terminal. Worlds marked with the final notation of annihilation pulsed back to life, their biospheres registering equilibrium where only decay had been permitted to exist. The models failed first. Predictive engines recalculated until heat bled from their cores, cycling through assumptions that had never been questioned because they had never been wrong. Inputs were verified. Sensors were cross-checked. Historical parallels were loaded and discarded. Each iteration returned the same impossible result. Mortality curves flattened into quiet lines. Resource depletion reversed. Social collapse failed to manifest. The universe, as the League understood it, had committed an error. Within the silent councils, attention focused with surgical intensity. Observation platforms reoriented. Additional computational mass was allocated. Patrol fleets adjusted formation to tighten quarantine perimeters that no longer made sense. Shields continued to hum softly around worlds that were no longer dying, their vibrations now sounding less like authority and more like hesitation. The cold precision that defined League response began to falter, not through chaos, but through uncertainty. What rippled through the collective consciousness of the observers was not triumph. It was dread. This sensation had no variable in their systems, no coefficient or comparative data. It spread anyway, a pressure without mass, a tightening awareness that something foundational had been violated. The League had tolerated survival against odds. It had cataloged miracles as statistical outliers. This was different. This was a systematic dismantling of inevitability. Humanity had not cured the disease in any traditional sense. No singular treatment, no elegant counteragent, no clean victory had been logged. Instead, the conditions that allowed extinction to be efficient had been stripped away piece by piece. Transmission pathways were gone. Behavioral assumptions had been rewritten. Environmental stability had been weaponized against entropy itself. The disease still existed in traces and remnants, but it no longer had permission to matter. The League's doctrine had always rested on efficiency. Evolution favored outcomes that conserved energy, minimized waste, and punished weakness swiftly. Extinction, when it occurred, was clean, predictable, economical. Humanity had turned that logic inside out. By flooding the system with effort, empathy, and relentless adaptation, humans had made extinction inefficient. It cost too much. It took too long. It failed to conclude. Across the data streams, analysts observed patterns they could not name. Human intervention did not converge toward equilibrium in the expected way. It oscillated, adjusted, and surged in response to micro-changes faster than models could track. Where other species sought stability, humans embraced volatility as a tool. They reshaped social behavior as aggressively as they reshaped physical environments, fracturing large populations into resilient clusters and then reconnecting them under new rules. The League attempted to quantify this behavior and failed. Emotional variables corrupted predictive clarity. Acts of self-sacrifice skewed resource allocation models beyond tolerance. Individuals willingly absorbed risk that should have collapsed efficiency curves. Entire teams functioned past survivable thresholds without measurable decline in output. The numbers did not merely resist prediction. They defied it. In archival chambers, previously resolved cases were reopened for comparison. None matched. In past pandemics, intervention had delayed collapse at best. Natural selection always reclaimed control. This time, selection itself had been bypassed. Humanity had not strengthened the species through loss. It had preserved it through refusal. Survival had been decoupled from sacrifice. Observation drones recorded images that disturbed even the most insulated analysts. Cities once dark now glowed with improvised life. Infrastructure bore scars of damage hastily repaired, yet functioned with renewed purpose. The air over those worlds no longer carried the spectral signatures of mass death. Instead, it pulsed with regulated circulation, engineered balance, and the faint chemical markers of recovery. These were not pristine systems. They were resilient ones. The League's core axioms began to strain. Non-interference had been declared absolute because intervention distorted outcomes. Humanity had intervened so completely that outcome itself had been altered. The concept of an inevitable trajectory no longer applied. Where the League saw a line from cause to extinction, humans saw a network of leverage points, each one an opportunity to change direction. Fear deepened as secondary implications surfaced. If extinction could be made inefficient here, it could be made inefficient elsewhere. If inevitability could be treated as a variable rather than a law, then the League's authority rested on a fragile assumption. The universe was not obligated to be clean. It was not required to be fair. Humanity had chosen to care anyway, and in doing so, had rewritten the cost structure of survival. Patrol fleets received updated directives and found no actions aligned with doctrine. Escalation would violate foundational principles. Withdrawal would acknowledge failure. Observation continued, but now it carried a different weight. The Watchers were no longer neutral. They were witnesses to a precedent forming in real time. Across multiple councils, the same conclusion emerged without formal coordination. Humanity represented a systemic anomaly. Not because of technological superiority or numerical dominance, but because of an irrational commitment to preserving life at any cost. This commitment introduced noise into the universe, a turbulence that prevented clean endings. Where the League sought resolution, humans generated persistence. The dread sharpened as long-range projections updated. Future crises no longer ended where they should. Collapse scenarios stretched into prolonged struggles. Losses still occurred, but annihilation retreated, replaced by grinding survival fueled by collective effort. The universe grew messier. Less efficient, harder to simplify. The League had been founded on arithmetic, not mercy. Now arithmetic itself was under threat. The equations still functioned, but their conclusions no longer held authority. Humanity had exposed a flaw not in the numbers, but in the assumptions beneath them. Extinction was no longer guaranteed to be the cheapest outcome. As the anomaly stabilized into a new reality, one truth became impossible to suppress. The League had not merely underestimated humanity. It had misunderstood the nature of resistance. Humans did not oppose the universe through strength alone. They opposed it through refusal, through relentless care, through an unyielding insistence that no calculation was complete while lives remained to be saved. The error state persisted. The universe did not resolve it. And for the first time in the League's long history, certainty began to feel like a liability. The quarantine fields lifted without ceremony. their shimmering walls thinning into nothing as containment harmonics powered down across the Rhel Expanse. There were no fireworks, no mass signals of triumph, no declarations carved into orbital light. The worlds beneath simply inhaled. Atmospheres equalized, pressure gradients softened, and wind moved freely again through streets that had been sealed for survival rather than celebration. The first unfiltered breaths carried the scent of rain, clean metal, soil turned by rebuilding hands, and the faint, almost forgotten warmth of continuity. Cities did not erupt into noise. They settled. Power grids stabilized into steady rhythms. Emergency lighting dimmed to normal illumination. Sirens that had defined every moment fell silent, leaving behind an almost painful quiet broken only by machinery powering down and the distant hum of restored transit lines. In that quiet, life asserted itself not through spectacle, but through persistence. Markets reopened without announcements. Children returned to open spaces that had once been forbidden geometry. The saved worlds did not rejoice. They resumed. Above them, the League watched doctrine dissolve in real time. The lifting of quarantine should have marked closure, the final punctuation on a resolved anomaly. Instead, it exposed a fracture that spread through foundational assumptions with relentless clarity. Systems built on millennia of precedent found no stable state to return to. The event refused classification. It could not be archived as intervention failure or exceptional success. It sat outside permitted outcomes, a proof that the framework itself was incomplete. Across council chambers, data continued to arrive long after the crisis was officially ended. Recovery rates exceeded historical maxima. Secondary extinctions failed to occur. Ecological cascades stabilized rather than collapsing. Species that should have been irreparably weakened displayed renewed adaptive capacity. Humanity's influence had not merely prevented death. It had altered trajectories. Evolution itself appeared to hesitate, forced to contend with a variable it could not easily erase. Humans had looked at evolution and refused to let it decide alone. This refusal was not philosophical. It was operational. They had treated natural selection not as an authority, but as a process subject to intervention, optimization, and moral override. Where the League saw inevitability as law, humans saw it as a challenge to be worked until it broke. Compassion, applied without restraint and backed by relentless competence, had outperformed the coldest logic of the cosmos. The realization spread unevenly through the League, resisted at first by inertia and pride. Non-interference had been sacred because it simplified responsibility. Allowing extinction absolved the observer. Humanity had stripped away that comfort. By acting, by succeeding, they had made inaction visible as a choice rather than a necessity. The doctrine fractured not from external attack, but from internal contradiction. If extinction could be prevented without collapsing the universe into chaos, then allowing it demanded justification that arithmetic alone could no longer provide. Observers reviewed recordings of human activity inside the former quarantine zones with renewed attention. They saw exhaustion carried like armor. They saw infrastructure built not for elegance, but for endurance. They saw decision-making that privileged saving the maximum number of lives over preserving theoretical purity. Most unsettling of all, they saw humans grieve openly even as they succeeded, honoring losses without allowing those losses to dictate surrender. The emotional data, once filtered as noise, now appeared central to the outcome. Across the galaxy, other civilizations took note. The precedent traveled faster than official acknowledgement. Signals spread through academic channels, trade networks, and cultural memory. The story was not transmitted as propaganda, but as a cautionary revelation. There existed a species that treated extinction not as a boundary condition, but as a solvable problem. A species willing to spend itself to preserve strangers. A species that did not wait for permission when the cost of waiting was measured in lives. The League attempted reformulation. New doctrines were drafted, softer in language, yet careful not to concede authority. Committees formed to study human intervention as a special case. None of it erased the fundamental shift. The galaxy had witnessed inevitability fail. That knowledge could not be contained. Once seen, it altered perception permanently. Every future crisis would now be measured not only against past outcomes, but against what humans had proven possible. On the restored worlds, traces of the crisis remained etched into architecture and habit. Reinforced structures bore the scars of rapid construction. Environmental systems retained redundancies designed for emergencies that might never come. Social patterns incorporated flexibility, schedules layered with contingencies learned under pressure. These were not signs of fear. They were signs of memory. Survival had not erased the experience. It had integrated it. Human teams departed quietly. Their vessels lifted without fanfare, hulls still marked by atmospheric burns and improvised repairs. They left behind data, tools, and frameworks designed to outlast their presence. They did not claim ownership of the recovery. They treated it as shared labor, a responsibility transferred rather than imposed. In their wake, the worlds continued forward, altered but alive. From that moment on, the galaxy understood something it had never formally articulated. Humanity was not an anomaly of survival. It was a force of revision. Where other species adapted to the universe as it was, humans adapted the universe to include them. They bent systems without breaking them. They introduced friction where collapse demanded smoothness. They filled gaps in causality with intention. Extinction, once considered the final accountant of existence, lost its monopoly on endings. It remained real, still capable of devastation, but no longer absolute. Humanity had proven that with sufficient resolve, coordination, and care, even the most indifferent processes could be slowed, diverted, or rendered irrelevant. The meaning of survival expanded beyond endurance into stewardship. The League did not issue a declaration acknowledging this shift. It did not need to. The evidence persisted in living worlds, in broken models, in doctrines rewritten through omission rather than proclamation. The arithmetic that once governed galactic order still functioned, but it now shared space with something it could not quantify. A refusal, a commitment, a species that treated compassion not as weakness, but as a tool sharpened to a relentless edge. History would later mark this event as a turning point, though not with dates or titles. It would be remembered as the moment inevitability faltered, as the era when the universe learned that calculation alone could be challenged. Humanity had stepped into a role no equation had predicted and refused to step back out. The saved worlds continued to breathe, and the cosmos, colder and vaster than any single species, adjusted around a new truth. Extinction was no longer the final word.